Now we're going to turn to the first discussion of the morning, which is entitled Dialogue Across Divides, the 20th anniversary of the Pugwash Rotblat Nobel Peace Prize and the 60th anniversary of the Russell Einstein Manifesto. The first speaker will be Professor Kit Hill. And Kit, I'd ask you to introduce yourself a little bit as well before you start with your slide presentation, if that's all right.
Thank you, Sandy.
I'm sorry.
Well, to introduce myself, I suppose I'm fortunate in having been in the same profession as Joe Rotblat, and therefore having known him for quite a long time. In fact, we first met in 1960 when I was on the wrong side of an examination table. Relations improved from then on. And for a time, I was professor of physics on one side of the river, and he was professor of physics on the other side in a different hospital. So we interacted in that way, and then we interacted a great deal over Pugwash. I hope that's enough, Sandy.
That's great, thank you.
For me. Now, I've been asked to spend no more than 15 minutes, Sandy says, in describing to you the life of an extraordinary man who lived a very long life, 97 years. I'll do my best. The reason we're here is to celebrate, and Rotblat was deeply involved in both of the events that we're here to celebrate. The launching of the Manifesto in 1955, there's Russell reading out the Manifesto, which we'll come back to later on, and there is Joe Rotblat's left leg, I think. He was chairing the meeting. And the other event we're celebrating, of course, is the awarding of the Nobel Prize. Joe was born in Russia. Warsaw was part of Russia in 1908. Poland was just a province, officially. And he was born into a family of pious Orthodox Jews. His father was a merchant, paper merchant. And I think the first 7 years or so of his life seems to have been reasonably calm and happy. Then in 1915, Germans invaded Russia, overran Warsaw, and things went very bad indeed. Sometime before his death, Joe invited a number of us to celebrate a birthday to a very lovely dinner, at which were served some beautiful new buttered potatoes. Joe refused them, to our astonishment, and explained that ever since the wartime, when they were living in a basement and surviving pretty much on rotten potatoes, he couldn't bear the taste of the things the rest of his life. However, they pulled through. Joe clearly was very bright. He took himself to night school, became an electrician, and went on and worked for a degree in physics in the unofficial university, because he wasn't admitted to, as a Jew, he wasn't admitted to Warsaw University. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, this early stages when he was struggling against the odds. I'd like to then come on to the period of his life from about 1938-39 onwards, when he was working as a physicist and trying to understand this phenomenon of nuclear fission. And then from 1945 onwards, apart from working 24/7 as a professor of physics, he was explaining the implications of nuclear fission to the rest of us and hopefully to our lords and masters. Here is Joe when he's become a physics student, a PhD student, looking fairly gaunt. That's his student card. Life was not entirely gloom and doom. He seemed to have managed to get off on holiday with a bunch of fellow students down to the Tatra Mountains, I think, and met Tola Grun, and they were married in 1935. I'll come back to that. Now, nuclear fission and what Rutherford referred to as the Wily neutron, which had been discovered in 1932 by James Chadwick. Physicists are great guessers, and there's a lot of guessing going on in the 1930s. Thank you. Niels Bohr had picked up on Chadwick's discovery of the neutron and started to guess that the nucleus of the atom was made up of both neutrons and protons. And 2 or 3 years later on, a bunch of young physicists, almost all of whom, ironically, were either escapees or potential escapees from Hitler's Germany, started to take an interest in the in the nucleus of the some of the very heavy elements, particularly uranium, and the fact that they appeared to be unstable and capable of breaking up. Now, as I say, this was particularly worked on by this half dozen people around Europe. And at that stage, Joe was working under Ludwig Wertenstein, who apparently inspired him very greatly. In this picture, either of them look particularly inspired, but apparently they were. Wertenstein had got around quite a bit. He had spent time in Paris with Marie Curie. He'd spent time in Cambridge with Ernest Rutherford, and there he made good friends with James Chadwick. And Rotblat and Wertenstein got to the point of wanting to have the latest must-have item for nuclear physicists, which was a cyclotron. And Chadwick had got a cyclotron in Liverpool. Chadwick had heard about Rotblat, obviously a bright chap, and would like to have him in his department for a while. So, on the very last day of July 1939, Rotblat arrived at this rather incredible building in the middle of Liverpool, which was Chadwick's physics department. Of course, on the following day, Germany declared war, invaded Poland, and 2 days later we were at war with Germany too. At that stage, Tola, his wife, Joe's wife, had gone down with appendicitis and was going to follow on. She never managed it. Joe made desperate attempts to get her out, but she eventually disappeared into one of Hitler's gas chambers. And that, I think, is something that must have coloured the whole of the rest of Joe's life. Well, now, I've got to move fairly fast because Joe arrived in Liverpool hardly speaking a word of English. And it was a couple of months or so before he had enough English to go and talk to Chadwick and explain to him what he and Wertenstein had already been discussing back in Poland, was that the instability of uranium nuclei made it quite possible that they could form a chain reaction, one nucleus disintegrating, triggering the next one very, very fast. And we all know what the result of that was. Well, this message was passed on to the British government and the American government, and to cut a very long story short, the Manhattan Project was set up in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Chadwick was appointed in charge of the British group at Los Alamos and insisted against American opposition in having Rotblat with him. So Joe went to Los Alamos early in 1944. Towards the end of 1944, Chadwick had a dinner party at which Rotblat was present, and so was General Groves, who was the boss man at Los Alamos. Groves told the assembled company that American policy had changed. They now believed that Germany wouldn't be able to make the bomb, but nonetheless, they intended to keep going with the bomb because they wanted this in order to suppress the Russians. This is Joe's account of the thing. This led Joe to consider his position and, on conscientious grounds, to resign from the whole project, which was a very brave thing to do because it was tantamount to mutiny in wartime. But he got away with it, and he went back to Liverpool, started to consider what else he would do with his physics. One of the things he wanted to do was to look for applications in medicine. And this curious picture is an attempt by Rotblat and his clinical colleague Ansel to use radioactive iodine to map out where a tumour was in a patient's thyroid. And this, I believe, is the first example of anyone in the world producing anything approaching a radioisotope scan. And it's also, as far as I know, the first attempt of anyone in the world to produce anything in the line of what we now call a medical scan. I think it was years before CT and MRI, and quite a bit before ultrasound even. So, a year later than that, in 1989, Joe was appointed Professor of Physics at Barts Hospital. And, as I say, for those of us who were his colleagues, it was clear that he was working 24/7 at that job, but somehow he managed to have a huge amount of energy and time to put into his concerns with nuclear weapons. And here he is on Panorama following the announcement of the hydrogen bomb. Now, also on that program was Bertrand Russell, and Russell enlisted Rotblat to help him, first of all, with the launching the Manifesto, and then doing what the Manifesto wanted, which was to get influential scientists from around the world who were already networking among themselves, and so had good relationships among themselves, whereas national governments sometimes didn't have good relationships. And they with the benefit of a man called Cyrus Eaton, who owned this place in a little fishing village called Pugwash, Nova Scotia, they assembled a large group of, I mean, this is an incredible event, if you can't think of it. In the middle of the Cold War, the big brains of nuclear science from all around the world, United States, Britain, France, Russia, China, were all able to get together. And that was the launch of the Pugwash Conferences movement. Now, Joe, at this stage, Russell put Joe in charge of organising this meeting, and Joe then became Secretary General of Pugwash, and subsequently President, and worked extremely hard in all sorts of directions. Here he is. He managed to get very good relationships, I think, with people at the top and also people at the bottom. Here he is with Gorbachev. Gorbachev at some stage remarked that, in his opinion, Pugwash had very considerable influence in the ending of the Cold War, and it would have been Joe who was at the centre of the work that was done there. Joe came to me sometime after he got his Nobel Prize, and he worked like anything at Pugwash, but he came to me and said, "You know, kid, I try to accept all these invitations I get, but would you mind going to Andorra to speak to their cultural and scientific society? I'm afraid I can't manage that one." So it's quite interesting to have coffee with the Prime Minister of Andorra and talk about how he's going to face going to New York to discuss Andorra being part of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So there's a thought. Joe was very keen to involve young people, as Sandy has just said, and one thing he did in particular was to bring across the Atlantic from the States the organisation called Peace Jam, which is active in this country, and Sally Milne is particularly coordinating this. Joe had no false pride, and where there was a cause that he felt he should get involved in, he did so. And here he is in the middle here, campaigning on behalf of Mordecai Vanunu, who was the Israeli whistleblower who blew the whistle on the Israeli nuclear weapons program, and then got kidnapped in Rome and taken back to Israel and jailed. But Joe not only did this sort of thing, but the next thing you knew, he was off in Israel thumping on the table of the president of Israel. It's extraordinary how he managed it, but he did. But he was never afraid to ruffle feathers, and he certainly ruffled a few feathers in this country. When he got his Nobel Prize, the Daily Telegraph wrote that he should be in prison rather than taking tea with the King of Norway. And when he was knighted by the Queen, the Sunday Times produced this rather wonderful headline, which gives you pause for thought, really, when you come to think about it. Blair honours CND. The extraordinary thing is that for those of us who knew him and were lucky enough to know him well, and there are a number of you here I know who did, I think if you looked around, wondered if you could find the model of the true English gentleman, or someone who did what our politicians nowadays want us to do and express the best of British values, you'd be very hard put to it to do better than Joe Rotblat, Russian-born Polish immigrant. Anyhow, it's a funny old world, isn't it? Well, now, I've got a feeling that Sandy is kicking my heels, and I think that's enough, probably Joe would say. Let's get on with the job. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a real treat for us to be able to hear just a synopsis of Joe Rotblat's life from somebody who knew him well, both scientifically and through involvement with Pugwash. So, Kit, thank you very much for taking the time. Kit was on a train, I think, at 4 a.m., is that correct, to get here today. So he's very much, oh, I can't seem to make this thing click over. There we go. So now I'm going to lead us in a discussion from a different perspective. As I said before, my name is Sandra Ionno Butcher, and I first got involved with the Pugwash network actually as a student. And for a long time, I was very involved in the Student Pugwash USA network. And I got to know Joe Rotblat and most of the people in this room first as being involved as a member of Student Young Pugwash. Today, what I'm going to focus on is looking at things from a slightly different perspective. Most times when people write histories of Pugwash, and Joe Rotblat, by the way, asked me to write the history of Pugwash, which I started a long time ago, and I am pleased that I'd never finished that project at the time, because if I had, while I was still a student before I started working for the organization, I don't think I would have understood really what I was writing about. But through the work I've been able to do with Paolo and others here in the room and elsewhere, I've really gotten a better understanding of what is involved with an organization as complex and yet as simple as what ours is. There's an emerging body of work being done now to look at Pugwash and other similar organizations, not only in terms of through the lens of the social responsibility of scientists, but also, as Paolo mentioned earlier, looking at Pugwash as a pioneer in the development of what's now called Track II initiatives or diplomacy. Track II wasn't known as Track II back then. It was only first discussed in the early 1980s. One of the definitive definitions came in early 1991. And so Track II is the unofficial, informal interaction between members of adversarial groups or nations with the goals of developing strategies, influencing public opinion, and organizing human and material resources in ways that might help resolve the conflict. So then the next question becomes, and one that we're always asked, is how do you evaluate this kind of work? And most of our funders and our constituents in various places always want to know, how do you evaluate it? And I was honored to be invited to participate in a session out at the Hoover Institute to explore these sorts of things, specifically this idea of transfer in Track II diplomacy. In other words, we can sit in rooms like this and have a lot of good ideas, but how do we actually measure what's getting transferred from these meetings or interactions and whether or not it has impact? And my job in that session was to talk about the historical side of things, but also to be a little bit of a devil's advocate and say, maybe it's not so easy if we just look at the idea of outcomes in a standard definition. So I'm going to very quickly run through a few examples from the Pugwash history, just to see what we how we can apply these sorts of thoughts. Kit already went into some of the earlier background of Pugwash. I won't repeat what he said. But I think the most important thing is that this was an organic response of scientists, people who knew most about the dangers the world was facing, and they were really feeling their way through the darkest days of the Cold War. So they wouldn't have known to say that they were involved in Track 2 because this idea of Track 2 didn't exist at the time. They were just very instinctively trying to address an issue. The questions about Track 2, people quite often, if any of you are involved in seeking funding for things, you're usually said to write on a funding proposal, what is the expected outcome, what is the impact going to be? And it's really hard to say. Certainly for us, that's one of my most difficult jobs. So one of the things that happened with the Manifesto is that it helped convey this importance of having scientists meet in conference to the general public. But it also raises a question about our work, which is, you know, the actual meeting itself is only part of the work. What was important about the Manifesto was the hours and hours and hours and weeks and months involved in trying to get these people to agree to even have their names on a joint statement. And then, of course, later to have people gather in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. So all of that work contributed to creating the positive atmosphere, even though they hadn't yet sat at the table. The first Pugwash conference was determined a great success. People, though, in deciding whether or not to come, there's a quote from Mark Oliphant who he said, well, he wasn't sure about coming, but he said, can I say no and feel decent? And I think some of these threads still follow for our work today that we're going to start to hear more about. There's a sense of people of goodwill who want to get together to try to solve an issue. They don't necessarily have the answers. Sometimes it's hard just to sit with the other. The Chinese scientist who came to the first conference wasn't sure if he was physically in danger in coming to the meeting or not. There are all kinds of concerns. We talk about this as a very historical exercise, but it's much more than that. It's a personal commitment, it's courageous commitment, and it only works when there's goodwill among the people who come to the room. Joe Rotblat always said the most important thing about those early Pugwash meetings was that they could find a common language. Even though the world was set up in terms of fear of the other, and I think there's a lot of that happening today. So for sure, we just need to look at the newspapers and listen to the news, and we're overwhelmed with this fear of the other. But the point is that there are ways in all different sorts of issues to find a common ground and to find common language. Back then, the common language was scientific language. Today, it might be a different sort of dialogue, as we're going to hear later throughout the morning. There's examples of the first working group actually getting to that point where they could talk about this linear no-threshold theory of the effects of radiation in the nuclear testing. And that was the turning point, he said, in the meeting, where the scientists from both sides could actually agree on something. And that laid the groundwork for some other things. But as Rotblat said, as a pack of individuals, we have no power whatsoever, only intellectual muscle. I think Paolo and many of us these days, sometimes we feel that way. We do feel that we have no power. But nevertheless, we manage to influence the thinking very often and the reaching of agreements on an official governmental level. There are examples. I'm not going to go into great detail because I prefer to spend the time in the discussion that we'll have later. But for example, with the partial test ban treaty, this is an area that historians point to in terms of Pugwash success, and it was one of the interesting points about this is that they came up with an idea for black boxes, and the actual black box was never used, but what it did was it signaled to the powers that be that there was a way to get through this idea of inspecting and verifying whether or not there'd be an agreement. So for those people who were trying to determine whether or not the Pugwash work on the partial test ban treaty was a success, well, no. The black box theory was never actually put in. We didn't get a comprehensive ban. There are a lot of people who, at that time, there are a lot of people who feel that the Pugwash work that led towards the partial test ban treaty was actually a disappointment because it wasn't a full ban. But in some ways it was a success. And as Matthew Evangelista, who has written a very good book on Pugwash during this time period called Unarmed Forces, he said that this time period planted the seeds for future work. So again, if you're filling out they didn't have to probably at the time, but if you're filling out your score sheet for a funder, you wouldn't know whether that was a success or a failure. So sometimes the time frame for these things is impossible to really know. There was a famous Pugwash, well, it wasn't famous because it wasn't very well known, but there was a very important Pugwash back channel during the Vietnam War that went directly to the top on both sides. And it was codenamed Pennsylvania. It involved Henry Kissinger. It involved Ho Chi Minh and a lot of people in between, including Henry Kissinger. He wasn't yet even in government. Some people say that this may have been where he first got involved in these sorts of issues. But I put this example up here because a lot of people think of Pugwash only in terms of the work, the more famous work that it's done on the arms control and disarmament sorts of issues. But this thread of being involved in conflict resolution and finding ways to decrease and contribute to conflict resolution has always been part of it, especially when it's involving adversaries or is somehow connected to the threats of nuclear use or nuclear superpower status, or however you want to define it. The Pugwash work on the ABM Treaty was quite influential. It's not that Pugwash was the only one working on this or the other sorts of examples that I'm giving, but one of the more interesting points I think about this treaty, so this is an anti-ballistic missile treaty where when it was first introduced, the idea of ABMs were first introduced into the meeting, Milne, who was the most senior Soviet person there, was quite concerned and argued vehemently that it's crazy to think that you can't put up defenses against these things. How can we possibly not have defenses? And as I understand it, for several years, throughout many, many meetings, the Soviet side continued to argue against this idea. But much later, Rotblat was told that Milne actually came to the agreement in the very first meeting. He thought he understood what the point was, but he wasn't able at that point, for whatever reasons, he had to work it through his system once he got back. And I think that's a parallel that happens today in perhaps some of our meetings as well, that you never really, if you're trying to assess what happens in a particular meeting, if you walked away from those, you'd think there's no way. Listen to the Soviets, they're so belligerent about this idea. But actually, those meetings were transformative. So we don't quite know what's happening. And then there's also this idea of, for some, there's an asymmetry sometimes in some of the rooms where it's more difficult for some parties to come to a table than the other parties. And when they leave what some people have called the bubble of the Track 2 table and then go back into their home environments and try to put forward these sorts of ideas, it's difficult. And so there's got to be a way to understand that dynamic and still understand that what happened in the room is important and potentially transformative, but to have patience that over some years or however long it might take, these issues will come forward. With the CFE treaty, this is another time when Pugwash had, this time there's documented very direct impact that the organization had. A lot of this was done through Frank von Hippel and Kokoshin on the Soviet side. There are letters that were exchanged. This is part of the historical record at this point. And Gorbachev eventually, as a result of Pugwash workshops on, the results of Pugwash workshops on non-offensive defense, it was linking this idea that if you want to remove, for example, the US nuclear weapons from Europe, you have to look at the conventional side of things. You can't just look at one side of the picture. And so through this work, Pugwash was able to help link these ideas. Gorbachev withdrew tanks. Eventually the CFE treaty was signed, but it also helped with other arms control agreements. But there are other organizations, the Federation of American Scientists, there were a lot of other groups involved with this, so there's a question of who actually owns transfer. Again, if you're trying to tick off a box, can you claim that you were responsible for that? The answer isn't necessarily so clear-cut. Chemical and biological weapons, some of the early Pugwash conferences were called the first clear markers on the route towards international anti-CBW regimes. Some say it was Kissinger's first exposure to serious arms control thinking about biological weapons. Julian Perry Robinson, who was one of the leaders of the Pugwash CBW work, said that what was important about it, and I think this again affects some of what we do today, reflects some of what we do today. He said that what was important about this work was that it was person-to-person contacts, that there's a continuity of contacts, they're not just one-off meetings. There was research conducted at times when it needed to be done, and they communicated their results more widely. And he said what's unique about Pugwash is the sustained attempt to do all four together, and to the degree that is now evident, have succeeded in the attempt. There's been spin-offs of the Pugwash work, including the formation of SIPRI. There were some very influential things started between academies of sciences. And I would think that some people think that when there's spin-offs of work, and again, as there has been from some of our work that we do currently in different parts of the world, spin-offs, I think, are a success rather than a failure of an organization. I think it shows that there are people motivated who then take it to another level that perhaps our format might not be able to sustain. I think it's important to note, too, that the skills and capacity building goes both ways. We work all the time with people in government and outside of government who are friends of the process, who they are transferring information back to us and skills and a way of working, in addition to the way that people gain from a Track 2 exercise and going the opposite direction. There's a question, when Pugwash got the Nobel Peace Prize, one of the naysayers in the news was Frank Gaffney, who called Pugwash dupes of the Soviet Union. There's still always this suspicion that when an organization is trying to talk to the other, that means that there's, that they're being led by the other. This happens all the time in our work in the Middle East and in South Asia. Paolo knows it well, and I'm sure he'll talk about it a little later. It doesn't mean just because we listen and just because we hear from all sides, and there's proof in the Pugwash history during the Cold War that it wasn't just one side that was trying to influence the process. It was all sides were trying to influence the process. So you have to be aware from many different directions and try to keep a certain kind of independence. There's intergenerational capacity building. I don't want to dwell on that. I think maybe that I'm standing here at all is a little bit of proof to the way that Pugwash has worked on this. I should note that Herb York said that the trick that Pugwash succeeded at was inviting future officials. That's the trick. That's the hard part. Primakov was an ex-foreign minister. He became foreign minister. And John Holdren, whose other quote is on here, as we know, was very involved. He was the chair of the Pugwash Executive Committee for a very long time. He's now currently President Obama's science advisor. But Holdren said Rotblat probably accomplished equally as much through the efforts of others that he inspired, that he is energized, that he is motivated, that he is propelled, that he is embarrassed into doing more on this problem than they would otherwise have done had Joe Rotblat not been there behind them, educating, propelling them into the arena. And I think some may say that Paolo is doing well following in the footsteps of Joe Rotblat in that respect. There's aspirational goals that Pugwash has promoted over the years, not just on nuclear weapons-free world issues, but on creating norms for other sorts of challenging WMD problems and regional conflict. And Pugwash dialogues still continue today. That's what after our session concludes here, we are going to spend the rest of the day focusing on the current issues, because after all, that's why we're all here. That's what motivates all of us, is trying to make a difference in today's environment, in today's world. And my point about that is that we are still doing the exact same work. The face and the focus of some of it looks a little bit different, but we're going to hear later on today from Dr. Al-Shahrastani, who when we get to that point of the discussion, we'll hear that he is as much a moral leader in these issues as Joe Rotblat was, and we have a great deal of work together to move forward. I want to conclude with this slide. This one's very important to me. This is Joe Rotblat meeting my son Joey, who is his namesake. Joey's in the room. And Joe Rotblat loved this picture because he said that there was almost 100 years spanning the two of them, but there was this connection still there. And so that's just a little bit of a personal note. But now, Joey, I'm going to ask you to work. There's a microphone in the back of the room there. You see it on the, yeah? And we're going to need help handing the microphone around if you don't mind. This is how you get roped into things, and we expect you back here 20 or 30 years from now, sitting up here. So what we're going to do now, we have 20 minutes to go into a question and answer period. Due to the webcasting, we have to ask a few things. We have to ask you, when you stand up, to please identify yourself. And we request that you do stand up, otherwise you won't be seen by the cameras. There's a camera coming this way, but there's also one that will just have a wide shot of the audience as you ask a question. Before I open it up fully to everybody, I would like to, there's more than two people in the room who have direct contact, but specifically, I would like to ask Bruce Kent, who's here and has been a great leader in the nuclear disarmament field and a moral leader in his own right. I wonder if he'd like to have a couple words. I know you knew Joe Rotblat and you were quite involved in these sorts of issues, if you wanted to ask a question. And Sally Milne, who worked very closely with Joe Rotblat. I'd like the two of you to kick us off into the discussion, if you wouldn't mind, please. In whatever order. I don't mean to put you on the spot. You're also... Joey, can you... Yes, please. And please stand up. And introduce yourself to those who might not know.
This is entirely unexpected. I'm not sure that I thank you. Yes, I knew Joe Rotblat extremely well. I visited him perhaps once a week when he was confined to his home in northwest London. I saw him in the hospital before he died, just before he died. I wasn't present at his death, but I knew him very well, admired him immensely. And on his behalf, I'd like to ask you a question, if that's all right. This country is on the edge of spending anything up to £150 billion on another generation of nuclear weapons. What's Pugwash's position on this?
We like it.
I'm going to let Christopher Watson, the chair of British Pugwash, answer that question. But I also wanted to say that, Joe Rotblat often said that at the founding of the organization, he and Bertrand Russell made a decision. And at one point, they decided that Russell would go off and be involved with and spend his focus with CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the public outreach, and that Joe Rotblat would focus on the more kind of private, more elite way of interacting on these issues. And I think the fact that you and he managed to stay in that close contact over the years shows that he always respected both ways of moving forward on these issues. Christopher, now you get to...
Christopher Watson, British Pugwash. It's a difficult question to answer, partly because, like everyone in Pugwash, we operate at two levels. One is a very private level in which we try to influence people who we believe are in a position to take decisions about these things. Another, a much more public level, in which we try to persuade the great British public that they ought to think in one particular way. In that latter role, we are greatly constrained by the fact that most of our activities are carried out within the framework of the British charity law, which forbids us to campaign for any particular political point of view. And the way in which we solve that dilemma is that we focus on providing the objective evidence which will enable other people to decide which political point of view they should support. And so a lot of our research, particularly to do with the Trident issue, has been to raise the questions that the politicians don't raise and make sure that the public can think about them. And we've held public meetings on all sorts of issues of that kind, and we like to think that message gets carried through to the political sphere. We've also been asked to write pieces for annual political party conferences, and again we have to do so in a manner which is politically neutral, but nevertheless draws people's attention to the real issues. And we like to think that the real issues will speak for themselves. I need hardly say that all the members of the British Executive Committee are of one mind in thinking that nuclear weapons are an entirely outmoded and unnecessary part of the dialogue between nations, and that we should abolish them as quickly as possible. But having that private belief is not the same as going out and campaigning publicly. We also have an organization called the Weapons of Mass Destruction Awareness Campaign, of whom we have a distinguished representative in the audience, and I think they might like to say something about it also.
I think some of these issues will come up later as well as we move forward, but if we don't mind, I'd like to move on to Sally Milne. If you want to stand up, please, Sally.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Sally Milne, and I was personal assistant to Professor Rotblat.
I think you might need to hold the microphone more directly.
Right. I'm Sally Milne, and I was personal assistant to Professor Rotblat and my son Tom before me. And I'd just like to say just three things, really. One, how pleased I think he would be that this meeting, reminding us all of these things, is here at the Royal Society that Sandy has arranged. He had tremendous respect for the Royal Society, and the Society had great respect for him as well. And its former president, Sir Martin Rees, who is, his portrait is on the wall, was a great personal friend and is a trustee of British Pugwash. I also think he would be delighted, however this webcast turns out, to be delighted that Pugwash is using this technology, because he was a great one for new technologies, and he was quite an inventor himself. And I'll just tell you of just one invention that he made in his home. Many years ago, he had, in his bedroom, behind a sort of great wall cupboard, massive wheels on which there was tape of Beethoven's symphonies and Chopin. And he arranged it so that he could operate it all from his bed. And he had this sort of wonderful mechanism that he had in his room, and he would thoroughly approve of Pugwash using the webcast to connect with many people, because the third thing I'd like to say is that he was a tremendous optimist and a great believer in people of all kinds and all ages. And I know he would like a meeting like this to go out to as many people as possible. And this is the reason that he set up the WMD awareness program that Christopher alluded to with Carol Norton here, and also brought Peace Jam for younger children, school-age children and undergraduates, which Kit Hill alluded to, and which I am connected with. And he really was a believer that anybody at all could contribute to this great mission that Pugwash has. And I think we should keep the faith. And as Sandy was saying, many of our meetings, you don't really know the sort of effect they have. But I think culminatively they do have an effect. And that was certainly what he believed, because he knew that he was not going to achieve in his lifetime the aims that he had. But he had absolute faith that other people would carry them on, and that in the end they would be achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally. The academics talk about the building of the epistemic community, and that's one of the ways that they define Track 2 initiatives, and for sure Pugwash has contributed greatly to that. Sally, you talk about Joe Rotblat's love of technology, but I'm reminded that when it came to email, you still had to print out every email that he received because he wasn't quite that adept with the technology. And actually, the historians should thank him and you for that, because as that early email wasn't quite the same as we have today, we have a historical record that's been left because you printed out every email, and then he would handwrite the response, and Sally would go do the response.
It was that he said his fingers wouldn't work.
His fingers wouldn't work. Okay.
His fingers
That's a good excuse, but but no, and there are some more than 3 tons of paper that exist right now at the Rotblat archives, at the Churchill Archives in Cambridge. So if anybody out there is interested in finding more out about this work, we would be quite happy if you would continue to do some research on this. I also wanted to say, Christopher, you made a comment about there's differences of opinion in the rooms, and I have to say that that's always been part of Pugwash. Joe Rotblat himself said that he was not an absolutist, and he would never say that, given some situation in the future, that he might not have made might not make a different decision. I think it's easy to create this kind of idea of a sainthood out there, but that's not the case. He was a very practical man. And you showed, Kit, the picture of him in support of Vanunu, but it's also true that Shalheveth Fryer, who some consider to be the father of the Israeli bomb, was a regular and active participant in Pugwash meetings. So it's never been the case that Pugwash involves only one particular point of view or the other, but the point is that we all look towards the view of a world without nuclear weapons and a world eventually without war. Paolo?
Sorry, I want just a little bit to give a different taste of the problem that you were raised. You see, I think that nuclear weapons perform several roles. One role is defense. A country feels that there is another actor with nuclear weapons, and they need to countervail this. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but that's what's happening. Then there is another role, which is the role of prestige. Unfortunately, this is an important role too. Countries believe that acquiring nuclear weapons, keeping nuclear weapons, is something which puts them in a certain category of power that matters around the world. And the fact that the 5 nuclear weapons official states are identified with the 5 permanent member of the Security Council is something which is very, very bad. And I think we have to face this problem and understand that really the argument of the prestige is something that should be dismantled the more that we can. Once I was talking with some very senior Indian official, he said to me, well, if nuclear weapons were a currency of power, that it's true that we Indians need to have it. And I think this kind of argument is something which is, I would say, something that we should be, as Pugwash, very much against. I think that UK and France are the extreme of possessing nuclear weapons just for prestige. What you do with nuclear weapons? I mean, nothing. Nothing that can be understood or seriously managed. So I think that UK and France, to start with, could make a big effort to say and to make the point that prestige is not tied to the possession of nuclear weapons, but is tied to the elimination of nuclear weapons, and they should give their own contribution. So I would not, to your question, I would not answer like, well, we may have different opinion. I personally don't have any different opinion than saying that in this case, particular case, you should fight against improvement, spending money for nuclear weapons, and you should press the idea that in fact nuclear weapons are particularly useless in the case of UK, France. They're useless in general. I'm not saying that there is a role for nuclear weapons in the United States. In fact, they have not been used. But I think there are degrees in which this lack of utility is more evident. And I think the case of Britain and France is the top case.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry there's not a whole lot more time. We have to conclude here. We have to keep to schedule more than many may think that we normally do in a Pugwash meeting. It's in respect of the viewers on the webcast, that they know when to tune in at a certain time. This is the beginning of the day. There will be ample opportunity to have more discussion. I also want to say, because of the webcast, we haven't scheduled in a specific coffee break, but there is fresh coffee out there right now. Please feel free to go in and out as you might need to, for those of you in the room, to avail yourself. We'll take just 2 minutes to change over the panel, but first, can you please join me in thanking especially Kit, who traveled so far to share with us his expertise and personal experience with Joe Rotblat. It's been a great honor. We're just getting started, but thank you all, and we will now switch over to the next session.